everyone, I'm Amanda Shackleton and I'm going to be presenting to you the first part of Chapter 6 entitled The Flow of the Lesson, Learning. Enhancing Learning. In order to learn, there must be a point of tension where you realize you don't know something and then make a commitment to understanding the lesson or the material. Now, understanding something takes effort from within, and assistance most likely will be required to be sought from other people or resources. Now, our book states that there are many possible strategies with which to undertake this learning, and we certainly need to have proficiency in choosing and using these strategies. But most importantly, we need to appreciate that the use of strategies requires concentration, much practice, and skill. The operative requirement to enhance student learning is for teachers to see this learning through the eyes of the student. Too often, teachers are trained in a manner which focuses on teaching rather than student learning, and this is where our attention needs to change. In 2004, Mosley et al. Observed 69 classrooms for evidence of strategy teaching. Overall, 80% of the classes involved book reading, information giving, or task instruction. 65% of the lessons involved requests for answers to questions, and close to one-third involved the provision of specific information. Teaching that involved the use or suggestion of strategies was observed infrequently, with 10% of the teachers offering no such teaching. In 2010, Ornstein, Kaufman, McCall, Grammer, and Sansusi found that there are very few explicit conversations about the use of strategies in classrooms. Instead, memory dominates. Half of the observation intervals contain some form of request for memorization. The heart of learning to learn is about intention to use the material, consistency in appropriately using the strategies, and knowing when chosen strategies are effective. This idea is also called self-regulation, which term highlights the decisions required by the student in the process of learning. This chapter discusses learning, how we make it visible, and how to develop it. Learning starts with a backward design, rather than starting from textbooks and novel activities. Learning starts with the teacher and the student knowing the desired results, then working backwards to where the student starts the lesson, in terms of the student's prior knowledge and where the student is in the learning process. The purpose of this is to reduce the gap between where the student starts and the success criteria for the lesson. This requires a deep understanding about how we learn. There are about 4 overlapping considerations in learning, and the chart at the bottom of this slide outlines them. Unfortunately, there are no necessary direct links between each of these 4 ways in considering learning. Rather, they all play their part in the learning process. In 1970, Piaget noticed that children moved from very intuitive to more scientific and socially acceptable responses, especially as they become exposed to other peers and adults who take an interest in talking with them. He proposed 4 major phases relating to how student thinking develops qualitatively over time. And the first phase, sensory motor. Students view the world from their own viewpoint, primarily through movement and senses, and cannot perceive the world from others' viewpoints. Pre-operational. Via the acquisition of motor skills and language, students become more adept at using symbols, can use an object or role play to represent something else, but cannot yet mentally manipulate information or adopt the viewpoint of others. The third phase is concrete operational. This is when students begin to think logically, but in very concrete terms. And in the last phase, formal operational, students developed abstract reasoning and can think more logically. Being aware of the student's stage and his or her movement through the levels of thinking is among the most critical sources of knowledge. Having knowledge of these phases not only helps teachers to optimize the point at which the student is starting, but also is key to knowing the next higher level of the thinking processes towards which the student should be moving. Shayer and Hattie term this assisting as cognitive acceleration, based on 3 of Piaget's main drivers of cognitive development. 1. That the mind develops in response to challenge or to disequilibrium, meaning that the intervention must provide some cognitive conflict. 2, that the mind has a growing ability to become conscious of and so take control of its own processes, meaning that the intervention must encourage students to be metacognitive. And 3, that cognitive development is a social process promoted by high-quality discussion amongst peers and mediated by a teacher or other more mature person, meaning that the intervention must encourage social construction. Now, these aren't linked to ages because there's not a one-to-one relationship between age and these stages that Piaget had advised us of. Further, this is not discovery learning or peer collaboration without intervention. Scheyer advises us to remember that every moment of the lesson management involves the teacher being aware both of the processing levels of different aspects of the activity and also how each pupil's response indicates the level that they are processing at, and hence where they are presently moving up toward. Visible Learning Checklist Point 25. Teachers understand how learning is based on students needing multiple learning strategies to achieve surface and deep understanding. The 4 phases of the Solo taxonomy were introduced in Chapter 4. As a refresher, the 4 phases are unistructural, multistructural, relational, and extended abstract. So unistructural is like an idea, whereas multistructural is many ideas or a group of ideas. Relational is like relating ideas to each other and linking them in meaningful ways. And extended abstract is extending those ideas and drawing conclusions. Basically, as students encounter lessons, they acquire an idea or ideas and then relate and extend that or those ideas. Too often, students are asked to relate and extend with minimal ideas on which to base this task, leading to impoverished deeper learning. So many schools are naming themselves inquiry schools, as if this relating and extending can be accomplished without a firm basis of understanding the ideas. As has been noted, transfer across subject is notoriously difficult, and merely learning to inquire without embedding that inquiry in rich basis of ideas is not a defensible strategy. The claim here, instead, is that teachers must know at what phase of learning the student is best invested, in learning more surface ideas and moving from the surface to a deeper relating and extending of those ideas. The aim is to work at or 1 plus beyond where the student is working now. Now, as hard as it might be to believe, students do not remain in a constant state of being motivated. Winnie and Hadwin in 2008 outlined a 4-stage model of intervention as follows. Number 1 is to see a gap. The students need to see a gap between what he or she knows now and the intended learning. In the first stage, task definition, the student processes information about the task. In the second model, or the second stage, is goal setting. When he or she has sufficient but not necessarily complete information, he or she moves to phase 2. This involves goal setting and planning, whereby the learner frames a goal and works out a plan to accomplish the goal, with assistance as needed, of course. The third stage is strategies. When the students have goals and planning, they can search for strategies with which to move closer to the intention. This third stage involves enacting these strategies. And number 4, closing the gap. The student critically examines whether he or she has sufficiently closed the gap to claim access and thus be able to move on to different subjects. It is often moving from the first to second stages that can be most difficult for teachers and for students. Some students never get past the first stage, and Winnie and Hadwin noted that some teachers seem reluctant to allow students to get past the first stage. To make the transition involves being aware of the goals of the lesson, the nature of the gap, and then developing cognitive strategies and planning, as well as having the motivation to reduce this gap. A recent major review of how people learn identified 3 major phases moving from novice to capable to proficient as follows. Students come into class with preconceptions about how the world works, and teachers need to engage with this initial understanding, otherwise the students may fail to grasp the new concepts and information. For teachers to develop student competence, students must have a deep foundation of factual knowledge, understand the ideas and context of a conceptual framework, and organize knowledge in ways that facilitate retrieval and application. And 3. By building on these competencies, a metacognitive approach to instruction can then help students to learn to take control of their own learning by defining their learning goals and monitoring their progress in achieving those goals. These 3 principles mean that learning requires the active involvement of the learner. Learning is primarily a social activity. New knowledge is constructed on the basis of what is already understood and believed, and learning develops by employing effective and flexible strategies to help us understand, reason, memorize, and problem solve. The learning aim of any set of lessons is to get students to learn the skills of teaching themselves, the content, and the understanding. That is, to self-regulate their learning. All of this depends on expectations and mind frames that students can do this learning. The presence of appropriate challenge and the use of appropriate feedback, taking into consideration the student's current phases of learning. Now, there are at least 3 overlapping phases of learning: novice, through to capable, and then on to proficient. In the first novice phase, we try to understand the requirements of the activity and focusing on generating ways forward without making major mistakes. Then, as we acquire some capability, we are able to minimize more errors, our performance improves, and we no longer need to focus as intently on each aspect of the task or on the component parts of the knowledge. In the final proficient phase, we become more automated in our reactions to newer ideas, need less effort to execute each task, and as we become more automated, then in some ways we become less able to control the execution of the skills. Visible learning, checklist point 26. Teachers provide differentiation to ensure that learning is meaningfully and efficiently directed to all students gaining the intention of the lesson or lessons. All 4 of the above phases of learning emphasize teachers knowing where students are and then aiming to move them to +1 beyond this point. Thus, teaching of the whole class is unlikely to pitch the lesson correctly for all students. One of the truisms in most schools is that a year of schooling reflects the spread of capabilities more than anything else. By year 5, there is likely to be at least 5 years of spread in the capabilities of students in the class. By year 10, it is more likely 10 years of spread. Teaching to these differences has become a mantra for some. In some cases, diversity is taken to extremes. It merely means that all students are different. Tomlinson in 1995 demonstrated that there are 4 characteristics of effective differentiated instruction. The first is that all students need to have the opportunity to explore and apply the key concepts of the subject being studied, and then to achieve success. 2. Frequent formative interpretation is needed to monitor the student's path to success and the learning intention. This, more than other activities, will help to generate the highest probability of successful teaching and learning. 3. Flexibly grouping students so that they can work alone, together, or as a whole class as appropriate makes it possible to make the most of the opportunities created by difference and commonality. 4. As much as possible, we should engage students in an active manner to explore and reach the success target. To these, the author would add a 5th. Often the differentiation needs to be better related to differential learning gains. Those who gain more may need different instruction than those who gain less. These 5 characteristics help to ensure that learning intentions and success criteria are transparent to all students. The mistake is to assume that because students sit in groups, they're learning in groups. Galton and Patrick in 1990 have shown that merely placing students in groups rarely means that they work in groups in any form of differentiation. Providing instruction at the wrong level for each student is missing the mark. It's inefficient and ineffective. The key is to provide instruction sufficiently above the current student level and aiming to move the student +1 in their learning progression. This means that the teacher and the student is best equipped when they know not only the prior achievement knowledge and understanding of the student, but also how each student processes information, know the appropriate balance of surface to deep, know how to best motivate students to see a gap, to goal set, and to develop strategies, and to have a deep understanding of how students are learning. Visible learning, checklist point 27. Teachers are adaptive learning experts who know where students are on the continuum from novice to capable to proficient, when students are and are not learning, and where to go next, and who can create a classroom climate to attain these learning goals. Teachers need to be adaptive learning experts who not only use many of the effective strategies, but also have a high level of flexibility that allows them to innovate when routines are not enough. These teachers have high levels of empathy and know how to see learning through the eyes of the students and to show students that they understand how they're thinking and how then their thinking can be enhanced. A powerful way in which to see such learning through the eyes of the students is to listen to the students' questions and how students then answer their peers' questions. It is not routine expertise that we want, rather it's adaptive expertise, the ability to move between situations fluently and responsively. Adaptive experts listen for when the learning is occurring so that they can work out the point at which to intervene or not to advance the learning. Sometimes they need to disrupt the equilibrium, to break the habit, or to see error as an opportunity for intervention. Visible learning, checklist point 28. Teachers are able to teach multiple ways of knowing and multiple ways of interacting and provide multiple opportunities for practice. Recently, a group of approximately 35 eminent researchers summarized some of the major empirically grounded processes for learning. Their findings, with some added, relate to multiple ways of knowing, multiple ways of interacting, multiple opportunities for practice, and much feedback to know that we are in fact learning. So under the category multiple ways of knowing, the major message is that multiple ways of presenting material need to be provided close to each other with minimal distracting material. We can only process so much at a time, but we need multiple ways of seeing new ideas without overloading our working memory. So some examples of this could be that ideas need to be associated, should be presented near to each other in space and time. Cognitive flexibility improves with multiple viewpoints that link facts, skills, procedures, and deep conceptual principles. And the information presented to the learner should not overload the working memory, as was previously stated. Multiple ways of interacting. We learn best by interacting with the ideas, by deliberately rephrasing the ideas, and by finding coat hangers, so to speak, to link previous notions or examples, particularly where there is tension between what we know and what we are encountering. We need to be explicitly taught how to process such learning. So some examples of this could include outlining, integrating, and synthesizing information produces better learning than rereading materials or other passive strategies. Deep reasoning and learning is stimulated by problems that create cognitive disequilibrium, such as obstacles to goals, contradictions, conflict, and anomalies. And students need to be told that this is a normal part of learning. And most students need training in how to self-regulate their learning and other cognitive processes. For multiple opportunities for practicing, most of us, struggling or gifted, need multiple opportunities to learn new ideas, preferably over time, and we need to see the purpose of deliberately practicing. An understanding of an abstract concept improves with multiple and varied examples. Spaced schedules of studying produce better long-term retention than a single session of studying. And to maintain engaged and sustained learning, there is a need to see value and purpose in the practice, and a need to develop growing sense of confidence when facing challenges in this learning. And finally, knowing that we are learning. When we learn, we can make many errors, go in wrong directions, learn wrong information, and meet many challenges. And thus we are often dependent on just-in-time, just-for-me feedback to ensure that we move efficiently and effectively toward the success criteria. Some examples include making errors is often a necessity for learning then to occur. Students need safe environments in which they can go beyond their comfort levels, make and learn from errors, and know when they have erred. Learning wrong information can be reduced when feedback is immediate. And challenges help to make learning easier and thereby have a positive effect on learning and long-term retention of the material. How people learn. It's a powerful resource that can help teachers to understand many of the current findings and debates about learning. The findings that I spoke about previously are elaborated, and these are linked to 3 big ideas. Understand prior to achievement, use this as a link, and thinking about thinking. So understand prior to achievement. First, we use our existing knowledge to make sense of and learn new information. When people develop new knowledge, they build on and connect it to their previous knowledge or understanding. Linking between old and new. Although we start with existing knowledge, new learning is not simply tacked on brick by brick to the old knowledge, which is why the relationships between old and new understandings are so important. We come to know ideas and then we can be asked to relate and extend them. This then leads to conceptual understanding, which can then in turn become a new idea, and so the cycle continues. Thinking about thinking. We need to develop an awareness of what we are doing, where we are going, and how we are going there. We need to know what to do when we do not know what to do. Such self-regulation or metacognitive skills are one of the ultimate goals of all learning. They are what we often mean by lifelong learning, and it is why we want students to become their own teachers. A meta-analysis was done on the effects of teaching students various skills of studying and developing self-regulation. Of interest was whether these study programs need to be developed near or far from the outcome content domain. That is, could study strategies be taught in the content domain, or could they be generalized across domains? They found that programs were provided outside of the context of the subject matter, or more general study skills, are effective only when surface knowledge is the outcome. Programs run in context, that is, those associated highly with the subject matter to be learned, were most effective at surface and deeper levels of knowing and understanding. Our recommendations were that the thinking and study skills training should A. Be in context, use tasks within the same domain as the target content, and promote a high degree of learner activity and metacognitive awareness. The student needs to know various strategies that are appropriate to the task at hand. That is, the how, when, where, and why of their use. Strategy training needs to be embedded within the teaching context itself. Given these arguments, Bransford et al. In the year 2000 argued that classrooms need to be learner-centered because it is all about where the student is on the journey from novice through competent to proficient. Knowledge-centered. There needs to be knowledge so that connections and relations can be built. Assessment-rich, to better understand and articulate what we already know and can do, and to know when we are moving towards proficient and understand where to next. And community-centered, because there is no one way from novice to proficient, so we need to share and learn from each other. particularly so that we can see and enjoy the trials and tribulations of how we each progress, and to share the relevance in what we are aiming to learn.